Before we begin today's story, if you enjoy heartfelt stories about everyday heroes, kindness, courage, and the extraordinary impact one ordinary person can have on the lives of others, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that true greatness is measured not by power or status, but by compassion. Your support helps us continue bringing these inspiring stories to millions of people around the world. Now, let's begin. Sometimes the strongest family is built by a promise instead of blood. The emergency department at St. Matthew's Regional Hospital had barely caught its breath after a 12-hour shift when the shouting began. Emily Carter stood at the nurse's station, her light blue scrubs wrinkled, her sneakers soaked from hours spent racing between trauma rooms, her hands still trembling from trying to save a young father injured in a highway collision just 20 minutes earlier. She hadn't stopped moving since sunrise. She hadn't eaten lunch. She hadn't even remembered to drink the coffee, now sitting cold beside the computer terminal. Yet none of that mattered to Brandon Pierce, the hospital's operations manager. His polished shoes echoed across the spotless hallway as he marched straight toward her with dozens of employees and visitors watching. Do you have any idea how many complaints I've received because you ignored administrative paperwork again? He barked loud enough for everyone to hear. Emily opened her mouth, exhausted but calm. A little girl stopped breathing in room 12. The paperwork could wait. Brandon folded his arms with a mocking smile. Your job isn't to decide what matters. Your job is to follow orders. Around them, monitors continued to beep, stretchers rolled past, and conversations suddenly faded into uncomfortable silence. Several nurses exchanged worried glances, but quickly lowered their eyes. A young resident looked ready to speak before another physician quietly shook his head, warning him not to get involved. Emily felt every stare in the hallway settle on her shoulders. This wasn't the first time Brandon had embarrassed her in public, but today felt different. Today, the humiliation lingered longer because nobody moved. Nobody defended her. She simply gripped the small antique pocket watch clipped beside her ID badge, the only thing she had left from her late father, taking one slow breath to keep herself composed. Brandon noticed the gesture and smirked. Still hiding behind old memories instead of doing your job? He sneered. Before Emily could answer, the hospital's automatic entrance doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, and an elderly man wearing a weathered leather vest stepped quietly inside, his steady eyes locking onto the trembling nurse before he spoke a single unforgettable sentence. The hallway seemed to hold its breath. The elderly man walked with an unhurried confidence that did not match the faded leather vest resting across his broad shoulders. His gray hair was neatly combed, his heavy work boots carried the dust of long roads, and the deep lines across his face spoke of decades spent earning respect instead of demanding it. Nobody recognized him except for a few visitors near the entrance whose expressions quietly changed the moment they saw him. Emily assumed he was another family member coming to visit a patient, but there was something unusual about the way his eyes remained fixed on her instead of the crowded emergency room. Brandon let out a short, dismissive laugh. Visiting hours are restricted. If you're looking for someone, ask the front desk instead of wandering into staff business. The older man ignored him completely. He stopped only a few feet from Emily and studied her face with unexpected warmth before his attention drifted toward the antique pocket watch clipped beside her identification badge. His expression froze for the smallest fraction of a second, almost too quickly for anyone else to notice. Emily instinctively covered the watch with her hand. It was an old habit. Whenever people asked about it, she simply said it had belonged to her father. She never knew much more than that, because he had rarely spoken about his past before he passed away. Brandon stepped closer, irritated that he was being ignored. I'm talking to you. Still no answer. The older man continued looking at the small silver watch as if it carried a memory only he could understand. Around the lobby, several visitors quietly reached for their phones, not to record the argument, but to send short messages. Outside the hospital entrance, the low rumble of motorcycle engines gradually faded instead of growing louder, as though dozens of riders had deliberately shut their engines off at the same time. Through the glass doors, Dark motorcycles now lined the curb with perfect order, their riders remaining seated without making a sound. Inside, the reception clerk noticed them first. Then a security officer glanced outside and suddenly straightened his posture. Emily sensed the atmosphere changing, but she could not understand why. The older man finally lifted his eyes from the pocket watch and looked directly at her with a sadness that seemed to stretch back many years, while Brandon, completely unaware of what was unfolding around him, decided to make the biggest mistake of the afternoon. Brandon mistook the silence for fear, and his confidence only grew. He stepped directly between Emily and the older man, forcing the conversation back onto himself. "I asked you a question," he said sharply. "This area is for staff and patients only. Unless you have hospital business, you need to leave." The older man remained perfectly calm. His weathered eyes never left Emily. It was as though Brandon's words simply did not exist. Emily felt increasingly uncomfortable. She had never seen this stranger before, yet there was something strangely familiar about the compassion in his expression. She quietly cleared her throat. "Sir, if you have a family member here, I can help you find their room after this is over." A faint smile crossed his face. "You have always helped people first," he said softly, "just like your father." Emily blinked in surprise. Her heart skipped. "You knew my father?" Before she could ask another question, Brandon interrupted with a loud scoff. "Enough of this nonsense. We are running a hospital, not a family reunion." Several nurses lowered their heads even farther, hoping the confrontation would end before it became even more embarrassing. "Hey!" Young orderly glanced toward the entrance and quietly took 2 nervous steps backward after noticing the growing line of motorcycles outside. None of the riders entered. None of them spoke. They simply waited with remarkable discipline, their attention fixed on the hospital doors. Inside the lobby, the reception clerk whispered something to the security officer, whose expression immediately changed from routine professionalism to visible concern. He reached for his radio, paused, then slowly lowered his hand without saying a word. Brandon noticed none of it. Frustrated that the older man continued ignoring him, he reached toward the antique pocket watch hanging beside Emily's identification badge. "If this little trinket is distracting my employee from doing her job," he said with a mocking grin, "maybe it belongs at home instead of inside my hospital." Emily instinctively stepped back and covered the watch with both hands. The older man's face hardened for the first time since entering the building. His voice remained quiet, but every person close enough to hear it immediately stopped moving. "Do not touch what was entrusted to her." The words were calm, almost gentle, yet they carried the unmistakable weight of a promise that had been kept for more than 2 decades, even if nobody in that hallway understood it yet. Emily tightened her grip on the old pocket watch without fully understanding why the stranger's words made her feel safer than anyone else's had all day. The hallway remained silent, except for the distant rhythm of heart monitors and the occasional announcement echoing through the hospital speakers. Brandon forced a laugh, hoping to recover the authority he felt slipping away. "You are making a dramatic scene over an old watch and an employee who cannot even follow simple procedures." His voice was loud, but it no longer carried the same confidence. Too many eyes were watching now. The older man finally turned toward him with steady composure. There was no anger in his face, only quiet certainty. "She has spent her day saving lives," he said. "Perhaps you should remember what this building was meant for." Brandon folded his arms and shook his head. "Do not lecture me. I run operations here." Before anyone could answer, the hospital entrance opened once again. One by one, several men wearing weathered leather vests stepped inside. None of them raised their voices. None of them crowded the lobby. They simply removed their caps out of respect for the patients, stood several feet apart, and waited. Nurses exchanged confused glances. Visitors whispered to one another. Even the security officer chose not to interrupt them after noticing the calm discipline in every movement they made. Emily looked from the newcomers back to the older man. She could not understand why they all seemed to be waiting for him without saying a single word. One of the riders caught sight of the silver pocket watch clipped beside her badge and immediately lowered his eyes with unmistakable respect before giving the older man a nearly invisible nod. It lasted less than a second, but Emily noticed it. Brandon did not. Still convinced he controlled the situation, he pointed toward the entrance. All you need to leave before I contact law enforcement. No one moved. No one argued. The older man slowly reached inside his jacket and carefully unfolded a faded photograph that had clearly been carried for many years. He looked at it for a long moment before extending it toward Emily. The moment her eyes met the picture, the color drained from her face because standing beside the younger version of the man in front of her was her father, smiling as though they had once shared a bond she had never known existed. Emily's fingers trembled as she accepted the faded photograph. The edges were worn soft from years of being folded and unfolded, but the faces remained unmistakably clear. Her father looked 20 years younger, wearing the same gentle smile she remembered from childhood, his arm resting across the shoulder of the man, now standing quietly before her. Behind them stood several motorcycles beneath a bright summer sky, and across the bottom of the photograph someone had written in faded blue ink, "Some debts are never repaid. They are honored." Emily looked up in disbelief. "How do you have this?" she whispered. The older man drew a slow breath before answering. "Because your father handed it to me himself." The hallway fell even quieter. Brandon glanced at the photograph with obvious impatience. "I do not care about old family pictures. This is still a hospital, and I expect every employee to remain focused on work." No one responded to him. Even the physicians who had avoided the confrontation moments earlier found themselves listening. One of the leather-clad riders near the entrance lowered his head respectfully and said in a calm voice, "President Donovan has carried that photograph every single day for 24 years. Another rider nodded without adding another word. Emily stared at the stranger. "President," she repeated softly. The older man finally offered a small, tired smile. "My name is Marcus Donovan." Several visitors immediately recognized the name and exchanged stunned looks. They had expected loud voices and intimidation from a man with such a reputation. Instead, they saw nothing but quiet restraint and genuine concern for a nurse who had never met him. Brandon folded his arms again, refusing to acknowledge the change in the room. "Whatever organization you belong to has no authority inside this hospital." Marcus did not argue. He simply turned back toward Emily. "Your father once made me promise that if life ever left you standing alone, I would never let it stay that way." Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes. She had spent years believing her father had taken countless stories with him when he died. Now, standing in the middle of the emergency department, she realized his greatest promise had been silently waiting for her all along, and somewhere nearby another voice quietly said, "The hospital director needs to see this immediately." Emily could barely hear the conversations around her anymore. Her eyes remained fixed on the photograph, while questions she had carried since childhood rushed through her mind all at once. Her father had never mentioned Marcus Donovan. He had never spoken about motorcycles, promises, or the men quietly standing throughout the lobby with respectful silence. The only thing he had ever told her was that a person's character was measured by the lives they lifted, not the titles they carried. Suddenly, those words felt less like advice and more like a message left behind for this exact moment. Brandon broke the silence with an impatient clap of his hands. "This conversation is over. Emily, return to your station immediately. Mr. Donovan, you and your friends need to leave before you disrupt patient care." His voice echoed through the hallway, but it no longer commanded the room. Several nurses who had remained silent earlier exchanged uncertain looks. A respiratory therapist quietly stepped beside Emily without saying anything, a small gesture that did not go unnoticed. Marcus folded the photograph with remarkable care before placing it back inside his jacket. "No one here came looking for trouble," he said calmly. "We came because a promise brought us here." Brandon scoffed. "Promises do not change hospital policy." Marcus gave a slow nod. "No, but they change lives." Before Brandon could respond, one of the riders near the entrance removed his gloves and spoke for the first time. 24 years ago, Captain Daniel Carter walked into a burning warehouse while everyone else was backing away. He carried our president out when he had every reason to save himself instead. The lobby grew completely still. Emily's breathing caught. She had always been told her father died years later from illness after retiring from the fire department. No one had ever mentioned the warehouse or the rescue. Another rider quietly added, "After that day, your father refused every award they tried to give him. He only asked Marcus for one thing. He said, 'If my little girl ever needs someone and I cannot be there, you stand where I cannot.'" Emily lowered her eyes toward the pocket watch in her hand as tears threatened to fall, unaware that the hospital director had just stepped out of the elevator and had heard every single word. Dr. Nathan Brooks stopped just outside the gathering crowd, his white coat still unbuttoned from finishing morning rounds. He had originally come to ask why patient flow through the emergency department had suddenly slowed, but the final sentence spoken by the rider rooted him to the spot. He knew the name Daniel Carter. Every firefighter in the county knew it. Years earlier, when Dr. Brooks had still been a young emergency physician, he had treated first responders who survived one of the largest warehouse fires the city had ever seen. Daniel Carter had refused to be called a hero even after saving multiple lives that afternoon. Looking at Emily now, Dr. Brooks quietly realized why the name had always sounded familiar. Brandon noticed the hospital director and immediately straightened his posture. "Dr. Brooks, thank goodness you are here. These people have interrupted hospital operations, and I was just about to have security escort them outside." Dr. Brooks did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward Emily and looked carefully at the silver pocket watch resting in her hand. "May I?" he asked gently. Emily nodded. He opened the cover and stared silently at the faded engraving inside. After several long seconds, he slowly closed it again. "I have seen this before," he said. "Your father carried it into the emergency room every time he brought someone to us. He said it reminded him that every second belonged to the person fighting to stay alive." Emily felt another piece of the past fall into place. Marcus watched quietly without interrupting. He had waited decades for someone else to confirm what he already knew. Brandon frowned. "With respect, Doctor, none of this changes the fact that Emily ignored administrative procedures." Dr. Brooks turned toward him with calm disappointment rather than anger. "Administrative procedures can be corrected," he replied. "Compassion cannot be manufactured." Several nurses lowered their heads, relieved that someone had finally spoken aloud what they had all been thinking. Before Brandon could defend himself again, an elderly man carrying a firefighter's cap stepped through the hospital entrance. The moment Marcus saw him, he removed his own cap without hesitation, and every rider in the lobby quietly did the same, revealing that another witness to the forgotten promise had finally arrived. The elderly firefighter paused just inside the entrance, holding the worn captain's helmet against his chest with both hands. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and although age had slowed his steps, the quiet dignity in his posture immediately drew every eye in the lobby. Emily had never seen him before, but the moment his gaze settled on her, his expression softened with unmistakable recognition. "You have your father's eyes," he said gently. Emily felt her throat tighten. "Did you know him?" The old firefighter smiled sadly. "For 32 years. We answered hundreds of calls together, but there was only one day that changed all of our lives." Brandon exhaled impatiently. "Can someone please explain why this has turned into a history lesson in the middle of my hospital?" No one answered him. Even he seemed to realize that the room had quietly stopped belonging to him. The firefighter walked toward Marcus Donovan, extending his hand without hesitation. Marcus accepted it with deep respect, and for a brief moment neither man spoke. They did not need to. Their silence carried the weight of memories shared long before anyone else in the lobby had entered their lives. Finally, the firefighter turned back toward Emily. "Your father never wanted this story told while he was alive," he said. "He believed kindness should never become a performance." Emily looked down at the pocket watch resting in her palm. "Then why tell it now?" she whispered. The firefighter glanced toward Marcus before answering. "Because promises have a time to stay hidden and a time to be honored." Several nurses quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Dr. Brooks folded his arms, listening with complete attention. Even the patients waiting nearby had stopped checking their phones. The firefighter slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a yellowed envelope sealed with faded blue wax. Emily immediately recognized the careful handwriting across the front. It was her father's unmistakable signature. Her heart began racing as the firefighter carefully held the unopened envelope toward Marcus instead of her. Daniel told me this was only to be opened when his daughter was finally ready to understand why Marcus Donovan owed him far more than a single rescue, he said quietly, leaving the entire lobby wondering what secret had remained hidden inside that letter for nearly a quarter of a century. Marcus accepted the sealed envelope with both hands, almost as if it weighed far more than a single sheet of paper. For several long seconds, he simply looked at Daniel Carter's familiar handwriting without breaking the aging wax seal. Emily watched silently, her emotions caught between curiosity and disbelief. She had spent years believing there was nothing left to discover about her father beyond old photographs and fading memories. Now it seemed an entire chapter of his life had been carefully protected until this very day. The retired firefighter nodded gently. He made all of us promise that no one would open it unless you were old enough to understand that real honor is not about being admired. It is about keeping your word when nobody is watching. Marcus slowly broke the seal and unfolded the letter with visible care. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained steady and unmistakable. He read the first lines quietly to himself before his eyes began to glisten. Dr. Brooks noticed the change immediately. Whatever Daniel had written was clearly something Marcus had never expected to see again. Brandon shifted impatiently. If this is another personal story, perhaps it should happen somewhere else. This time no one even acknowledged his interruption. Every person in the lobby remained focused on Marcus. After taking a slow breath, he finally read the letter aloud. Marcus, if you are reading this, it means my daughter has grown into the kind of person I always hoped she would become. She will probably never know how many lives you quietly changed after the fire, because you promised me you would stop living only for yourself. Marcus lowered the page for a moment, overwhelmed by memories. Then he continued, I did not save you so you could spend the rest of your life paying me back. I saved you because every life deserves another chance. If I am gone before Emily needs someone, do not repay the debt to me. Stand beside her instead. Protect her when she feels alone. That is how you will honor our friendship. Emily covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes, while everyone in the lobby finally understood that the promise binding Marcus and her father had never been about obligation. It had always been about passing compassion from one generation to the next. Silence settled over the emergency department with a weight no one had expected. Marcus carefully folded Daniel Carter's letter and returned it to the envelope, as though he were placing a treasured memory back into safe hands. Emily stood motionless, tears quietly tracing her cheeks, realizing that the greatest part of her father's legacy had never been written in newspaper headlines or displayed on plaques. It had lived inside the promises people kept because of him. Dr. Brooks stepped forward and faced the gathering staff. For years, he said calmly, I wondered why Daniel Carter refused every public ceremony we offered. Now I finally understand. He believed that recognition meant nothing if kindness stopped the moment the cameras disappeared. Several nurses lowered their heads, remembering how often Emily had stayed beyond her shift to comfort frightened families without asking for overtime or praise. Brandon looked around the lobby, expecting someone to support him, but every familiar face avoided his eyes. The confidence he had carried only minutes earlier was quietly disappearing. He cleared his throat. None of this changes the standards employees are expected to follow. Dr. Brooks answered before anyone else could speak. Actually, it changes far more than you realize. Hospital policy exists to support patient care, not to punish compassion. Emily looked at Marcus, still struggling to understand why a promise made decades ago had survived so faithfully. Marcus smiled gently. Your father once told me that people spend too much time asking whether someone deserves help. He said the better question is whether we deserve the chance to help them. Those words settled deeply over everyone listening. The retired firefighter nodded with quiet pride. That was Daniel. He never measured people by their worst day. Just then, the hospital receptionist hurried toward Dr. Brooks, carrying an old storage box she had found after hearing Daniel Carter's name. "Doctor," she said softly, "I think these belong to Captain Carter. They were donated years ago, but never displayed." Dr. Brooks slowly opened the box. Inside rested a faded commendation, several photographs, and one sealed official document marked for hospital administration only. As he read the first page, his expression changed completely, and he looked directly at Brandon before saying, "There is something about Emily's father that this hospital should have remembered a long time ago." Dr. Brooks held the document carefully, scanning each line before lifting his eyes toward the gathering crowd. His voice was calm, but every word carried unmistakable weight. 26 years ago, this hospital board voted unanimously to establish an emergency assistance fund for patients who could not afford life-saving treatment. According to these records, the anonymous donor who provided the first contribution refused to have his name attached to it. Emily listened quietly, unsure why her father's name had appeared inside an administrative archive. Dr. Brooks turned another page and continued. The donor was Captain Daniel Carter. A ripple of surprise moved through the hallway. Emily stared in disbelief. She had grown up in a modest home where every dollar mattered. She remembered her father repairing old furniture instead of buying new, driving the same pickup truck for years, and quietly helping neighbors whenever they faced difficult times. She had never imagined he had also given away money the family could barely spare. Dr. Brooks looked at Marcus before speaking again. The records also include a handwritten note. It says the donation was made after a private contribution from Marcus Donovan helped rebuild the lives of 3 firefighters injured in the warehouse disaster. Neither man accepted public recognition. Each insisted the other deserved the credit. Marcus lowered his eyes. "Daniel would never let anyone carry gratitude alone," he said softly. "Every time I tried to repay him, he found another family that needed help instead." The retired firefighter smiled through misty eyes. That is exactly what happened. They spent years quietly, competing to outdo each other's kindness. Several nurses exchanged emotional smiles as the story finally revealed its true shape. Brandon remained speechless, unable to reconcile the compassionate nurse he had publicly criticized with the extraordinary legacy standing behind her. Dr. Brooks slowly closed the folder. "Emily, this hospital has unknowingly benefited from your father's generosity for decades. Today we almost forgot the values he asked us to protect." Marcus stepped closer and gently returned the pocket watch to Emily's hand. "Your father believed that legacies are not inherited through wealth," he said. "They are inherited every time someone chooses compassion over pride." At that exact moment, members of the hospital board entered the lobby after being urgently called downstairs, and the expression on the chairwoman's face made it clear that the final chapter of this story was about to change more than one person's future. The chairwoman of the hospital board walked into the lobby with 2 board members close behind, her expression serious until she saw the documents resting in Dr. Brooks's hands. She took the folder, read the first page in silence, then looked slowly toward Emily before turning to Brandon. "Is it true," she asked quietly, "that you publicly reprimanded Nurse Carter immediately after she finished treating an emergency patient?" Brandon attempted to recover his composure. "I was enforcing administrative standards." The chairwoman closed the folder. "Administrative standards exist to support excellent care, not to discourage it." The entire lobby remained silent as she continued. "Captain Daniel Carter helped establish one of the programs that has allowed this hospital to save thousands of patients regardless of their financial situation. His daughter has continued serving this community with the very same spirit. Instead of recognizing that commitment, we allowed her to stand here alone." Brandon lowered his eyes for the first time. Dr. Brooks spoke calmly. "No employee should ever have to choose between saving a life and protecting their dignity." Several nurses nodded, and one after another, they quietly stepped beside Emily. "No, longer afraid to be seen supporting their colleague. The chairwoman turned toward Brandon once more. Effective immediately, you are relieved of supervisory responsibilities pending a full review of today's conduct and previous complaints. Brandon stood speechless. No one celebrated his humiliation. The moment felt too important for that. It was not about defeating a man. It was about restoring fairness. The chairwoman then faced Emily with genuine warmth. On behalf of this hospital, I owe you an apology. We should have defended you long before today. Emily could barely find her voice. I never wanted anyone to lose their job, she whispered. Marcus smiled gently. That sounds exactly like your father. The retired firefighter nodded in agreement. He always believed that justice should teach before it punishes. Dr. Brooks extended his hand to Emily. If you are willing, I would like you to help us improve how this hospital supports the nurses who carry the greatest burden every day. As the staff quietly gathered around her with new respect, Marcus looked at Daniel Carter's pocket watch one last time, knowing there was still one promise left to fulfill before he could finally consider his debt to an old friend complete. Emily looked down at the silver pocket watch resting in her hands before carefully closing its cover. For the first time since her father had passed away, it no longer felt like the last reminder of someone she had lost. It felt like the beginning of a family she had never known was still standing beside her. Marcus Donovan took one slow step forward. The years had carved deep lines across his face, but the quiet strength in his eyes never wavered. Your father gave me another chance at life, he said softly. I spent years believing I could repay him. I finally understand that I never could. The only thing I could do was keep the promise he trusted me to keep. Emily smiled through her tears. You already have. Marcus gently placed his weathered hand on her shoulder. No, he replied. Not until you hear these words from me. The entire lobby stood silent. Nurses, physicians, patients, visitors, firefighters, and every rider waited without speaking. Marcus drew a slow breath before saying the words he had carried in his heart for nearly 25 years. From this day forward, if you ever need someone to stand beside you, you will never stand alone again. Your father called me his brother. That makes you family. Emily stepped forward and embraced him without hesitation. It was not an embrace built on obligation or pity. It was the quiet recognition of a promise finally reaching the person it had always been meant to protect. Around them, every rider respectfully removed his cap. The retired firefighter did the same. Dr. Brooks lowered his head. Even the hospital board members stood in silent respect, understanding they had witnessed something no policy manual could ever teach. A few weeks later, the Emergency Assistance Fund was officially renamed in honor of Captain Daniel Carter, with a simple inscription placed in the hospital lobby that read, "Compassion is the only legacy that grows stronger when it is shared." Emily returned to work wearing the same silver pocket watch beside her identification badge. But now, every time she touched it during a difficult shift, she remembered that her father had not only left her a keepsake. He had left her an example. And every patient she comforted, every frightened family she reassured, and every exhausted coworker she encouraged became another chapter in that legacy. Because the greatest heroes are not remembered for the power they held, but for the kindness that continues long after they are gone, reminding us all to never judge another human being by appearances alone. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever met someone whose kindness changed a life without expecting anything in return? If so, share your story with our community. And if you believe the world needs more compassion, more gratitude, and more everyday heroes, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends and family. Every subscription helps us continue honoring the people whose quiet acts of kindness deserve to be remembered. Until next time, remember this: the greatest legacy we leave behind is not what we own, but the kindness we choose to share.